A single miscalculation is all it takes for an Israeli F-15I to be detected and intercepted over the Middle Eastern sky. The only thing preventing that scenario isn't luck, it's a plan executed with absolute, surgical precision. Every minute, every nautical mile, and every foot of altitude has been simulated countless times. At 5:25 a.m. on the 28th of May 2026, two squadrons of F-15I Ra'ams multi-role fighters screamed off the tarmac at Hatzerim Air Base in southern Israel. All navigation lights were killed. Radio silence was absolute. After reaching their initial cruising altitude, the formation rapidly dropped to just 300 feet as they crossed into eastern Iraqi airspace, hugging the flat desert floor and exploiting gaps in regional surveillance networks to mask their approach. 12 minutes later, they banked northeast, skimming the southern edge of the Zagros Mountains before dropping even lower to a hair-raising 200 feet as they neared the western Iranian border. Inside the cockpits, automated oxygen systems kicked in as the airframes reacted to the sudden altitude shifts. Every non-essential system, including secondary transmitters, was shut down to minimize the aircraft's electromagnetic signatures. Pushing deep into Iranian territory, the flight lead kept his eyes locked forward. On his joint helmet-mounted cueing system, digital terrain data, target markers, and radar coverage zones were projected with zero latency. He didn't need to look down at his consoles once. Every vital piece of intel was right in his line of sight. Before we go any further, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Type 9 if you stand with the US and Israel. Type 1 if you back Iran. And if you're a proponent of world peace, type 5. Now, stay sharp. We're heading into the combat zone. At 5:36 a.m., roughly 200 miles southwest of Tehran, the flight lead pulsed his afterburners twice a prearranged signal. The two wingmen immediately tightened the formation, closing the gap to under 2,600 feet to unify their radar cross-section. All four jets maintained a deck of 250 feet, staying beneath the floor of the early warning radar stations scattered across central Iran. They intended to hold this terrain-following profile for the next 230 miles. At that altitude, the only evidence of their presence was the jet wash kicking up dust clouds in the desert below a movement far too small to be picked up by long-range sensors. To the untrained eye, the F-15I looks similar to a standard Strike Eagle, but internally, everything has been deeply customized by Israel, from the electronic warfare suites and missile warning sensors to the weapon management software. The F-15I Ra'ams is a long-range strike variant, optimized for deep penetration missions where self-sufficiency is more important than external support. The most distinct feature of the Ra'am is the pair of conformal fuel tanks, or CFTs, mounted along the fuselage. They add over 5,000 pounds of fuel without significantly increasing the radar cross-section or aerodynamic drag, like traditional drop tanks. This allows the formation to maintain a massive combat radius without needing mid-mission refueling, a vital factor when the target is Tehran and high-value military assets deep inland. In the cockpit, the pilot used the new-gen Elbit helmet display, providing threat data and terrain contouring with a refresh rate of just a few milliseconds. In a low-level night mission like this, looking down at the dash for even a second can be a fatal mistake. Without these features, the CFTs, the helmet displays, and the upgraded EW suites, the jets would be forced to fly higher or refuel earlier, both of which would blow their cover and shrink their tightly calculated strike window. By 5:45 a.m., after covering over 330 miles, the formation began a gradual climb about 55 miles out from Tehran. This was the outer edge of their planned safe corridor, the point where they prepped for the final run on military facilities surrounding the capital. From this moment on, every move had to be perfect. Ahead of them, Iran's multi-layered air defense network was fully manned for the night shift, and a single anomalous blip on a radar screen could collapse the entire operation in seconds. This wasn't Yemeni airspace anymore. This was Iranian soil, protected by long-range early warning arrays and surface-to-air missile batteries on high alert. This is some of the most heavily defended airspace in the region. The 4 F-15 is split into pairs, banking in opposite directions to form a wide pincer movement approaching the rendezvous point from two different vectors. This staggered formation was no accident. It was designed to prevent the entire flight from being targeted at once while providing redundancy against ambushes or technical failures. At 5:58 a.m., at 23,000 feet over international airspace in western Iraq, a tactical contact appeared on the scope, the KC-707 Ra'am tanker, a heavily modified Boeing 707. It was holding steady in a designated zone codenamed Area 4. The tanker maintained a tight elliptical orbit at 300 miles per hour, allowing the fighters to approach without prolonged radio transmissions. The boom operator had already been briefed on the four-ship flight. The rule was clear: minimal comms. When the time came, the lead pilot, callsign Ra'am-1, rocked his wings once and slid into position under the Ra'am's belly. The light grey tanker cast a long shadow under the faint moonlight. The refueling boom was already deployed, its control surfaces making micro-adjustments to keep the nozzle centered in the high-altitude turbulence. Upon contact, the boom operator made one quick adjustment, and the nozzle locked into the F-15I's receptacle with a distinct metallic clank. Each jet took about 2.5 minutes to top off, restoring their combat radius to over 930 miles, even with a full weapons load. With Tehran as the target and military sites scattered across the southern defense perimeter, they needed every pound of fuel and every kilogram of ordnance. The KC-707 Ra'am has long been the backbone of Israel's long-range reach. Its high-flow boom system can transfer nearly 2,400 gallons per minute, allowing for rapid mid-air refueling without breaking formation for too long. Inside, the Ra'am is packed with indigenous avionics that prioritize fuel distribution and maintain line-of-sight secure data links with the strike package. Without this gas, the F-15Is would have to launch with a lighter bomb load or rely on forward bases, a tactical and political risk that was simply unacceptable for a mission of this magnitude. At 6:15 a.m., as the formation broke away from the tanker and pushed east, about 110 miles from the western Iranian border, the first electronic pulse flickered on the Ra'am's radar warning receiver. Initially, they were just erratic, short bursts. Seconds later, they became rhythmic sweeps. There was no doubt. Ground-based radar had gone active. The signal library identified it as a Russian-origin long-range surveillance radar, likely a spoon-rest variant integrated into Iran's multi-tiered defense net. The F-15 is held their course, but dropped another 1,200 feet, re-entering the radar shadow created by the terrain and the horizon line. Just 15 seconds later, a second source lit up a longer, more stable fan-shaped sweep. This was mid-range search radar, likely part of a mobile SAM battery guarding the western approaches to Tehran. The multi-layer net was officially waking up. In the cockpit, the pilot reached for the left console, toggling the L822 self-protection jammer. A controlled burst of active jamming began to radiate, designed to smear the return signal just enough to mask their exact position without alerting the enemy to a massive incoming jammer source. The sky over Tehran was still pitch black, but beneath that darkness, high-alert crews were staring at their screens, hunting for anything out of the ordinary. From here on, every move was high risk. There would be no second chances. Mounted on the centerline pylon, the electronic warfare pod hummed to life. Stable power, signal processors ready, then the first pulses were fired. They precisely covered the frequency bands the Iranian radar used to protect the capital. On the ground, the operators saw nothing overtly alarming. No clear incoming targets. No solid locks, just a thin layer of background noise, like atmospheric interference. It was annoying, but not enough to trigger a red alert. 3 seconds later, Ra'am-2 activated its pod. The L822 systems began coordinating via the flight's internal data link. They created out-of-phase pulse envelopes, making micro-adjustments to the timing and frequency of the return signals. On the enemy radar screens, the target distance stretched, the bearing shifted by a few degrees, and the altitude fluctuated wildly. If a missile were launched now, it would be chasing a ghost, a digital phantom created by an algorithm. At 6:32 a.m., A third radar flared up. Based on the pulse repetition and sweep cycle, it was likely a fire control radar for a SAM battery on the western edge of Tehran. The signal caught a target for a split second, held it, then lost it. The system never achieved a full lock, but the tension in the ground control room was undoubtedly rising. The jamming was working exactly as intended. The L-822 by Elta Systems is Israel's premier electronic countermeasure tool. Unlike simple noise jammers, the 822 uses digital radio frequency memory, DRFM, technology. It captures the radar signal in real time, records it, alters it by a fraction of a millisecond, and retransmits it back to the source. The result is that the enemy radar receives a distorted version of its own signal, confusing it on range, bearing, and even the number of targets. The system can handle up to 16 sources across multiple bands simultaneously. More importantly, it's integrated with the F-15's mission computer, automatically prioritizing threats and feeding the pod parameters without the pilot having to lift a finger. In a high-speed ingress, reducing the pilot's cognitive load is the difference between life and death. By 7:15 a.m., the F-15I formation cleared a low ridge about 15 miles from Tehran's western perimeter. From this point forward, terrain masking was no longer an option. The ground ahead was relatively flat. They were fully exposed. The pilots pushed the throttles to 500 knots, holding at 2,200 feet, low enough to compress the enemy's reaction time, but high enough to optimize the missile launch parameters. Every pilot had the same thought, hoping there were no mobile manpads teams waiting near the perimeter. Ahead, the faint lights of Tehran began to glow on the horizon. In the integrated helmet, the HUD overlay painted the targets, a military complex south of the city, where satellite imagery from just 10 hours ago showed long-range UAV launchers, 2 mobile radars, and a tactical command center. In the lead cockpit, the pilot's breathing was controlled and steady. Adrenaline was high, but the movements remained surgical. The airframe vibrated at this speed, but the automated targeting system compensated, keeping the locks stable despite the low-level turbulence. Each F-15I carried 4 Rampage missiles on reinforced underwing pylons. The angular bodies of the missiles sat just in the corner of the pilot's vision, a silent reminder of the firepower they were about to unleash. In the back seat of each jet, the weapons systems officer re-entered the target coordinates for a final verification. No further adjustments were needed. The missiles used preloaded GPS data backed by an encrypted inertial navigation system, allowing them to find their mark even if satellite signals were jammed. The distance dropped below 25 miles. From here, everything followed a pre-programmed sequence. There was no room for hesitation. In just minutes, the military sites around Tehran would become the epicenter of a calculated strike. At 7:26 a.m., as they closed in at high speed, the flight lead issued a 2-word command over the encrypted link, "Weapons free." Half a second later, the first Rampage dropped, followed by the second, and then 6 more streaks of fire. Every time a missile detached, there was a momentary silence, then a blinding white flash as the solid fuel motors ignited, propelling the ordnance forward. The missiles banked slightly northeast, correcting their paths to the preset data. In just 6 seconds, all 4 F-15Is completed their initial ripple fire. 8 missiles were now screaming toward their targets at Mach 1.5, staying low before arcing up in the mid-phase to maximize range. Impact was timed to be near simultaneous. The formation held its heading for 30 more seconds, even as warning lights indicated at least 3 radar sources east of Tehran were now sweeping them in unison. At 7:32 a.m., the first explosion tore through a military fuel depot. 3 seconds later, a reinforced maintenance hangar collapsed in an orange fireball. Then came the tactical UAV storage and the command center. Secondary explosions followed, confirming that munitions and fuel were cooking off inside. The Ra'ams pulled into a hard southerly dive to egress. The radar warning receiver shrieked with the distinct tone of a fire control lock. The Rampage missiles they had just fired are long-range air-to-ground weapons developed by Israel Aerospace Industries and Israel Military Industry, designed specifically for deep strikes from non-stealth platforms. The Rampage relies on high speed and an optimized trajectory to defeat multi-layered air defenses. At 15 feet long and traveling at Mach 1.5 with a range exceeding 90 miles, it doesn't use an active seeker in the terminal phase. Instead, it relies on its GPS, INS guidance. This means it emits no signal in its final approach, making it nearly impossible to detect or jam. That passive guidance is what allowed 8 high-value targets around Tehran to be hit simultaneously before the defense net could react. If they had been just 30 seconds slower, the radar activation at 7:42 a.m. would have given the batteries enough time to complete a lock-on cycle, and the risk of losing a jet would have skyrocketed. However, the Iranians were still in the fight. After the first wave, the formation broke hard left and right, performing a split maneuver to avoid concentrated fire. As the jets banked to observe the battle damage, the targets were nothing but glowing fires in the night. By 8:15 a.m., most of the target complex was neutralized. The formation pulled into a 5.5-degree climb, throttles in full afterburner. At 11,000 feet, the threat warnings went off in unison. A fire control radar from an SA-11 or SA-17 battery had achieved a lock, launching a missile from the 275-degree bearing. Number 3 called out 2 bright streaks appearing behind them. The missiles cleared their rails from a site southwest of Tehran, leaving 2 massive smoke trails. Even at a distance of miles, the formation immediately deployed chaff and flares, performing defensive breaks. The flight split in half to create 2 different vectors, complicating the enemy's lead pursuit calculation. There was no time to go low. At this stage, climbing was the only way to force the missiles to burn their energy. Sweat beaded on the flight lead's forehead. Despite the AC, he pushed the throttles deeper into the burner. The thrust pinned him to the seat, his mask tightening against his face. The threat display showed 2 missiles 18 miles back, closing the gap at Mach 2.4. At that speed, they would impact in under 40 seconds, but they were also nearing the limits of their kinetic energy and ceiling. By 8:30 a.m., the formation cleared the western ridges, leaving Tehran's immediate protection zone. The missiles were still tracking, but as they hit their max range and the radar locks flickered due to the jamming and maneuvers, their guidance became unstable. The ground crews tried to maintain the illumination, but it was too late. In the final seconds, both interceptors banked sharply north, lost energy, and detonated harmlessly in the air, miles behind the trailing F-15I. Not a single jet was touched. The cockpit grew quiet again, save for the hum of the engines and heavy breathing behind the masks. Mission accomplished. Behind them, the sky over Tehran was lit by the rising pillars of fire from the destroyed military sites.